special edition of EJIL Live, a production of the European Journal of International Law. EJIL Live was founded, like so many other things, by EJIL Editor-in-Chief Joseph Weiler. In many EJIL Lives, he interviewed several international law scholars, talking about their scholarship, but also their careers more generally. Now, after 17 years of being EJIL Editor-in-Chief, Joseph steps down. It is time to ask him some questions against the backdrop of the state of international law more generally. We will be speaking in this interview about his role as Editor-in-Chief. In an accompanying recorded version of an interview, we will be covering much more: his life as a scholar, as a teacher, as a practitioner, as an institution builder, as a son, a father, and a grandfather. Joseph, welcome to the Louterbeck Center of International Law.
Thank you.
Our managing editor, the wonderful Annie Brenner, has produced some vital statistics. Now, you introduced vital statistics to EJIL. It is the category, the rubric in which we give statistics about the journal to everybody, the readership, the authors, about the numbers of articles we get and the numbers of articles we publish. This time, Annie has produced some other vital statistics about what you have produced as Editor-in-Chief. 17 years of EJIL means 69 issues. I don't think they're all here. At least 21,468 published pages. As Editor-in-Chief, you also read all those articles that did not make it into the published pages. And we've done some calculations looking at all the articles that were submitted, and that must amount to at least 5,000 manuscripts. And knowing you from the editorial meetings, you will have read every one of them thoroughly. Let's get one burning question from one of our readers out of the way immediately. Why? Because an editor-in-chief makes a lot of enemies, because all these articles one rejects of one's colleagues. And at the same time, what the work one puts in is hardly ever noticed, sometimes not even by the authors themselves. So why did you spend such a significant part of your career on these pages?
Well, it was important for me. I thought that EJIL, founding EJIL with my 3 or 4 co-editors, Bruno Sima and Pierre-Marie Dupuy, the much lamented and missed Nino Cassese and Renaud de Hoos, was a good thing to do. I believed in it. And it just became part of my professional identity. So if you do something, do it well. Enemies notwithstanding.
Is there anything you will not miss of being Editor-in-Chief of EJIL?
Anything I will not miss? I won't miss writing those difficult letters to people saying, much as I love you, I'm afraid I can't publish this piece, or we can't publish this piece. Well, of course, there's a lot of drudge involved in the work. I'm not going to miss that, but overall, the truth is, I will miss it. I'm not leaving I'm not stepping down as Editor-in-Chief because I got sick and tired of it.
Founded EJIL, as you mentioned, together with Pierre-Marie Dupuy, Antonio Cassese, Renaud de Hoos, and Bruno Sima. And you did that the decision was made, if I could recall correctly, late 1980s, 87, and the first issue appeared in 1990. Why did this group of international lawyers, decide to establish EJIL?
It's a long time ago, so I'm not sure that my memory is altogether accurate. But Bruno Sim and I were walking around the quadrangle, of all places, Michigan Law School in Ann Arbor, a kind of fake Cambridge quadrangle. And I really think, I really think the motivation was, why should the American Journal of International Law dominate the English language international law scholarship? There should be an alternative to that. I think something of that nature, base as it might be, was our initial motivation. And then once we decided to go ahead, and Nino and Pierre-Marie Dupuy and Renaud and later Philip Alston joined us, we also tried to develop an alternative identity to the American Journal of International Law. But I think that explains the beginnings. And it was a bit different. We started with 2 issues per year. We started it with the idea that it would be an English-French international law journal, but that collapsed because, frankly, we didn't get enough French submissions. That's a shorthand of the beginning. It was a lot of fun.
Is it the case that French authors didn't submit to EJIL, or they didn't want to be published in French?
It's both. They didn't submit to EJIL, and when we wrote and tried to get French authors to write, several of them, perhaps even many of them, said, if I'm going to publish outside the French language universe of international law publication, I'd rather my article was in English so that more people read it. So it was one of these good ideas that didn't work out.
You founded EJIL in the late 1980s. You became editor-in-chief in 2008, taking over from Philip Alston. Were you involved in those early years? And when you took over in 2008, which ambitions did you have for EJIL?
So the early years of it, I've been involved with EJIL all along, not only since I became editor-in-chief in 2008. There was a period before that where I was book review editor. But in the early years, the editorial board, when we were still finding our way, we would meet all the 4 or 5 members of the editorial board. We would meet regularly.
And that editorial board consisted of the founders of EJIL?
Yes, to which later Philip joined us and was an important voice. It was different. It was more sort of pioneering, and everything was new and a lot of discussion, etc. And then with time, the role of the editor-in-chief as EJIL grew. It was now 4 issues. We couldn't have the whole editorial board meeting for every issue. Even for a period, we had 5 issues. Mm-hmm. And then we just couldn't manage. It was just too much work, so we went back to 4 issues. And at that point, the editor-in-chief role became more dominant, just because it couldn't work in that more collaborative way. And the editor-in-chief, the journal under Philip had a particular identity, and then the journal under me had a somewhat different identity, and then you joined us 5 or 6 years ago, and once again there was a change. So I think since I'm on the editorial boards of many, many journals, I like the model where the personality, worldview, scholarly disposition of the editors-in-chief actually push the journal in one way or in another way.
But one thing that we can say about the period in which you were editor-in-chief is that it has gone way beyond the journal in this sense. It has become, we have EJIL Talk, we have EJIL Live, we have EJIL the podcast. Was that always your vision, or did that kind of happen organically, randomly?
I can't remember. It's not as if when I took over as editor-in-chief, I said, we're going to have EJIL podcast, we're going to have EJIL Talk, etc. These things developed organically, but I do know that I thought to myself, I don't want just a managerial role, that just managing the journal. One has to lend it a bit of some personality, one must innovate, it must change, it must grow. So all those ideas are a result of that type of sensibility from the point of view of the editor-in-chief, not simply being a manager, but giving some directions. And from the point of view of the journal, from time to time surprising our readers. Wow, now there's a blog post, now there's a podcast, now there's EJIL Live. And tiny little things which I think add a little bit of color to the journal. For example, the roaming charges or the poem at the end of the journal. They're not crucial. Sometimes I wonder how many people read the poem, but it gives a little flavor. It's like changing your haircut.
Well, they're definitely reflections of your personality as they reflect in the journal. But let's speak a bit about what has appeared in these pages during your almost 2 decades at the helm of the journal. What do you see as the major changes in international legal scholarship during that period?
Well, first of all, it's grown in terms of type of scholarship. For example, there's a lot more empirical work. Empirical work resulted in a way from the development of the methodology that in many cases it's easier to do empirical work because everything is searchable online, stuff that would take you months to do if you had to collect it manually, one could do in 2 minutes.
Are you now speaking of quantitative or qualitative empirical work?
Quantitative empirical work. And then it came earlier to other disciplines. Law is a rather conservative discipline, but when it came with a vengeance, and we see now a lot of submissions. There were also changing notions of justice. For example, the whole turn to re-examining colonialism, the gender issue. I remember the shock I had when that famous article by Chinkin and Charlesworth came out. I started reading it and said, what has this got to do with international law? And I remember sitting in the library and thinking to myself, how could I have been so blind not to notice that? So they were the pioneers, and rightly so, it caught on. So for example, that kind of justice sensibility took on, and we see that reflected in the journal. And empirical also in a different sense. People were not satisfied with just exploring, even critically, in a normatively sense, critically, decisions of courts, but wanted to know what the impact was. How did it work out? So scholarship on award of damages, you didn't see that 35 years ago. And now it's... So there really has been a change in the kind of questions that international legal scholars ask and the time of articles that are published in EJIL.
And what stands out to you about the present moment in international legal scholarship?
So it's also very interesting because if I think of 10 years ago, the geopolitics was shifting to economics and the emergence of China, and from a normative point of view, globalization, the critical work on the WTO, neoliberalism, social justice in economic terms. Now we're back to where we were in the post-World War, where war and peace and international humanitarian law, I mean, think of Ukraine, think of Gaza, these kinds of threats, it's suddenly central. One finds ourselves when teaching international law that suddenly, where that was almost in a little way historical, it becomes so current. And of course, the whole phenomenon of cyber war and cyber aggression has become much more central. So there really is a shift. In some ways, I should say unfortunate, not unfortunate for the scholarship, unfortunate for the world, that suddenly we have the kind of phenomena that Ukraine or Gaza represent.
But that sounds almost like it's a shift back, as if we are in the same period. Or, I mean, as after the Second World War, or we're just back to the same themes as then. At the same time, you're speaking about these developments in conceptions of justice and the issues, and more attention for the impact of colonialism, the continued impact of colonialism, the gender question, the race question. So if we combine these two, so on the one hand we go back to the old fields, but at the same time these sensibilities have shifted. Do you think, is that shifting the scholarship?
I struggle with that because you know that although people think of me mostly as doing law, European law, international economic law, some classical international law, it's been a main occupation of mine as a theologian. And we find there are two conceptions of time. And sometimes it's comparing a Greek notion of time and a biblical notion of time. The Greek notion of time was more cyclical. Things happen and then they will happen again and then they will happen again. The biblical notion of time is it starts at a certain point and it's aiming directionally towards an apocalyptic moment. I don't know which is worse or which is better, but in reply to your question, it worries me that it's all cyclical. I mean, after the First World War, they used to say this is the last big war, the war to end all wars, and within a generation was an even worse war. And it worries me, if time is cyclical, are we facing another calamity? That these are just harbingers?
Well,
Despite our more attuned sensibilities to issues of justice, I really worry about it.
and another worry is that worry about the state of the world, a world that is burning, armies are killing, people are starving, is that sufficiently reflected on the pages of the journal? Should that be reflected on the pages of the journal? What's the relationship between international legal scholarship and the state of the world and international law within that world?
So yeah, I have a very distinct view, and I know that not everybody agrees with me. So one of the reasons to establish EJIL Talk was exactly to give a platform for immediate, thoughtful. EJIL Talk is not just a quick kind of reaction after you've had your fried eggs in the morning. It's serious scholarship, but it is rather instantaneous. It comes very shortly after the event by thoughtful people, because we realize that that type of scholarship, if it had to go into the journal, it would just lag behind the event so much that when it came into the journal, people would say, they would yawn. We've already been to that movie. So that EJIL should be the kind of scholarship that addresses those things, but with some passage of time, with the ability to reflect, to have a different, maybe more conceptual, theoretical, rather than immediate doctrinal set of questions. And I say this with a twinkle in my eye. When we get an article and it goes through the arduous process of screening and peer review, and the author starts saying it's very important for it to come out.
ASAP.
ASAP, I write back, the author knows there's a little twinkle in my eye, and say, you know, if you think it's so important that it will appear in the next 2 months, maybe we made a mistake in accepting it, because the philosophy of the journal, as distinct from the blog, is this has to be stuff with a shelf life of at least 5 or 6 or 7 years. So what difference does it make if it's 2 months earlier or 2 months later? But I think there's that kind of relationship. So when we talk about EJIL reacting to the contemporary international legal scene, one has to look holistically at EJIL Talk together with EJIL. And I think together, I want to believe we do a reasonably good job.
So that's about what the journal does. Now about you as an international lawyer. So, as I mentioned, the world is burning. You refer to several places in the world where the world is burning. You have close links to many of these places. Why stick to being an international law scholar? Have you never felt, I want to do justice rather than produce scholarship?
So, you say, why be an international law scholar? And you've defined me as a scholar. Now, I don't want to be false modest. I think I am a scholar. I think I'm a decent scholar. But I don't allow that word scholar to define me. So, over the last 2 years, in a very unscientific way, I have interviewed 70 legal scholars in America, in Europe, and in Asia. And I asked all of them 2 questions. How do you define your personal identity? And what is the most important thing towards that identity? And 70 out of 70 gave the same answer. I'm a scholar, and the most important thing is my scholarship. And that's not the answer that I give.
What is your answer?
I'm a teacher. I'm an educator.
I thought you were a beekeeper.
They said professional identity.
Okay.
If I became a professional beekeeper, it would take all the fun out of it. The bees would not be my friends, they would be my enemies.
But your professional identity is a teacher.
My primary profession, the way I understand my professional identity is a teacher. I got that from my father. He was a rabbi. A rabbi means a teacher. So, teacher and educator. So it's not just teaching law, but educating people. So that's the realm in which I think I can act in my professional thing. So I write scholarship, I teach and educate, but then there's also wonderful other dimensions to law which I've enjoyed very much, and they are in the realm of doing. It's litigating, it's consulting, it's drafting, it's helping in negotiations. And I love doing that, and I've done a lot of that. And it all feeds into each other. So it makes you, if you're a good scholar, you can be a good consultant. If you're a good litigator, you can teach, or you can be a better teacher, etc. So that's a holistic thing. But I know what you were aiming at. What is the role of the scholar in the public space as a public intellectual, etc.? So I'm sparing in that, but I'm not abstinent. So just to give you one example, which is contemporary, the first book I wrote before I even started my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation, was called Israel and the Creation of a Palestinian State. And of course, then it was very controversial in certain circles. The reactions were predictable. Some people praised the book and said this is of course the only solution forward. Other people, I got one book review in Foreign Affairs of all places. How could such an intelligent person write such a stupid book?
Some people sue you for that, for such a book review.
I've been sued, but I don't do suing. Interestingly, Rutledge came to me and said they want to bring out the book in a series that they called Revivals. And it has come out recently, and it's even on open access. And I asked them, but can I edit it? Because I read it. I hadn't read it for 40 years. And think of going back to the love letters you wrote when you were in high school. And I read the book, and many passages made me cringe. I wish I could have edited differently. But I wrote a new preface, and I stand by the book. I stood by it then, and now I say it shows me I was, even more than I was convinced then, that there was some truth to the position. It's very much an international law book as well, so that's my forays into classical international law. One of the important ones are in that book. And I have published op-eds. I had I don't want to say impactful in terms that it changed anything that happened, but had a lot of resonance on the democratic slide in Israel. And it was published in all major Europeans. So I do that, but I do that with care. And I always say to myself, my main contribution can be as a scholar and as an educator and a teacher. That's my métier. That's where I can maybe influence people and change their sensibility in the long run. So I don't rush into the public sphere. And I'm not on any social network. I don't tweet, I don't Instagram, I don't Facebook and all that, which is the normal place where people.
Mm-hmm.
So it is who I am, for good or for bad.
So Joseph, you're very modest about your expectations of yourself in changing the world. What were your hopes for the journal? Did you hope that the journal would change the world, or at least international law, or something else?
It might or might not change the world or what happens in the real world, but I think the world of scholarship, the world of scholars, of teachers, of thinkers, is to change the way we perceive the world, the way we understand the world, the way we understand international law, different sensibilities. That's what scholarship is about. I've had endless experiences in all kind of, it used to be called wise men, today it would be wise men and women, etc. And I always told my interlocutors from the field of policy, I'm not here to tell you what to do. That's your job as a policymaker. But I'm going to give you a bigger understanding, a better understanding of the problem you face so that you can take the right decisions. And that's what I think about a scholarly journal.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of one of the pieces of feedback you sometimes gave to articles, which is, don't give us a solution that actually feels very cheap and thin. Show us that the problem is even bigger than it seems in the beginning of the article.
That's my standard advice. try and avoid the here's a problem and here's my brilliant solution. Try and write an article that says here's a problem, and when you read my article you will see it's a much bigger problem than you thought at the beginning.
Well, I'm not so sure how good a sales pitch this is for EJIL. Open the journal and you find problems, and at the end of reading the journal you see that the problem is even bigger than you thought it was. But thank you very much for tuning in today. Thank you, Professor Weiler, Joseph, for everything you have done for EJIL the last 17 years as editor-in-chief, but also as a founder with your colleagues of this journal. For more EJIL, visit ejil.org for more EJIL Lives, for more EJIL the podcast, for more EJIL journal articles, for more EJIL Talk, the blog. Visit ejil.org where you can find all the links. Many thanks too to George Newman, our cameraman, today with us in Cambridge. Thank you.
Thank you.